Imagine standing at the edge of a swamp some 320 million years ago. The air is heavy, damp, and so thick with oxygen it almost clings to your lungs. The forest before you is not like any forest you know. There are no birds calling from the branches, no mammals rustling in the undergrowth. There are no flowering plants at all, no scent of blossoms carried on the breeze. Instead, a vast and alien wilderness stretches out in all directions, draped in shades of deep green and shadow. Towering above you are plants that resemble trees, but are not quite trees. Giant club mosses, some as tall as a 10-story building, rise like pillars from the sodden ground. Their trunks are not made of solid wood, but of fibrous, spongy material, supported more by water pressure than strength. Ferns with leaves the size of sails spread outward, catching the dim light. Strange horsetails, thicker than a human torso, form dense stands along the water's edge. Together, they create a canopy that filters the sunlight into scattered beams, so that the world beneath is cast in perpetual twilight. The ground itself is treacherous. Each step lands with a wet squelch, sinking into layers of peat formed from centuries of fallen vegetation. The smell of rot and moisture is everywhere, heavy and unrelenting. Pools of stagnant water collect in low places, their surfaces broken by the lazy ripple of amphibians lurking just beneath. The forest floor is alive with motion, not from mammals or reptiles, but from something stranger, something more ancient. The stillness is broken not by birdsong, but by the hiss of wind through fern fronds and the low chorus of amphibians calling from hidden pools. And then another sound, the faint, rhythmic clicking of chitin on leaf litter, a sound that grows louder, closer. Something stirs in the shadows. You turn, and what you see towers above any insect you could ever imagine. A centipede longer than a car uncoils itself across the forest floor. Its armored body, gleaming black and brown in the scattered light, ripples with the coordinated movement of dozens of legs. Each segment flexes with predatory precision. It is not rushing. It doesn't need to. In this world, it has no rivals. This is Arthropleura, the giant millipede of the Carboniferous. Up to 2.5 meters long, it is one of the rulers of this land, and it is only one of many. Here, on land, insects and arthropods have taken command. Fueled by an atmosphere rich with oxygen, far richer than the air we breathe today, they have grown to monstrous proportions. Dragonflies with wingspans the size of hawks patrol the air. Scorpions longer than a man's arm prowl through the undergrowth. Millipedes as long as crocodiles dominate the forest floor. It is a paradox of history. Normally, the oceans are where the giants live. But in this age, the oceans are quieter, safer, home to smaller creatures and the early ancestors of fish and amphibians. On land, however, the story is different. Here, oxygen has rewritten the rules. Here, the monsters live not in the depths of water, but in the shadows of the forest. For the first amphibians brave enough to crawl out of the swamps, the land was no sanctuary. It was a nightmare. Water was their only refuge. To understand why, we must first understand the atmosphere of this time. Today, the air we breathe is about 21% oxygen. It is enough to fuel our bodies, enough to spark the occasional fire, but low enough to be relatively stable. In the Carboniferous, the balance was very different. Oxygen levels rose to nearly 35%, higher than at any point before or since. The reason lay in the forests themselves. These vast wetlands of towering plants photosynthesized at an extraordinary rate, pulling in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. With so few decomposers and fungi able to break down all that organic matter, enormous amounts of carbon were trapped in the ground, compressed over millions of years into what would eventually become coal. The cycle drove oxygen higher and higher, filling the atmosphere with fuel for life and for fire. To breathe this air would feel strange to us. Each breath would deliver more oxygen than our lungs are adapted to handle. The air would feel denser, sharper. For insects, whose bodies draw oxygen through a network of tiny tubes rather than lungs, this was transformative. Their size is normally limited by how efficiently oxygen can diffuse into their tissues. But in this high oxygen world, that limitation vanished, and so they grew. They grew until the boundaries of possibility were stretched to their very edge. The land became a realm of giants, not because it was safe, but because it was dangerous. Oxygen turned the simplest creatures into terrors. Walk deeper into the swamp, and the air grows heavier still. A shadow passes overhead, not a bird, but a dragonfly. Its wings beat with a low, thrumming buzz, stirring the air as it sweeps above. This is Meganeura, the apex aerial predator of its time. With a wingspan of over 2 feet, it patrols the forest canopy like a raptor, scanning for prey with enormous compound eyes. Smaller insects scatter at its approach. Amphibians slip back into the water at the faint sound of its wings. For anything smaller than a mouse, this is death from above. On the ground, armored scorpions creep among the roots, their pincers raised, their tails arched and glistening with venom. They move with a deliberate patience, sensing vibrations in the soil. For an early amphibian crawling awkwardly from the water, such a creature could mean the end within moments. And then there is Arthropleura, the giant millipede. Harmless to humans if it lived today, more a lumbering herbivore than a predator. But in this world, sheer size is a weapon of its own. Nothing dares challenge it. Its armored plates clatter softly as it moves, the sound echoing like the creak of bending wood. The ground trembles slightly with its weight. Imagine being a small amphibian, newly adapted to land. Your lungs still awkward, your legs clumsy. Every step you take carries you into a land ruled by giants. Above, dragonflies the size of eagles. Below, scorpions longer than your body. And everywhere, the slow, relentless presence of creatures whose size defies belief. In such a place, water was not just home, it was safety. It was the only place where these monsters could not easily follow. The Carboniferous was the only time in history when the land was more dangerous than the water beside it. Normally, life clings to the land for safety, to escape the jaws of sharks, the coils of marine reptiles, the lurking shadows of cephalopods. But here, the reverse was true. In the swamps of this ancient age, the amphibians who first dared to crawl onto the land did so at great risk. Their bodies were fragile, their movements slow, their defenses weak. To them, the land was not a new frontier of opportunity. It was a gauntlet, a place of predators far larger than they could comprehend. And so, for millions of years, life clung to the water, waiting for the world above to change, waiting for the balance to shift. This was the only chapter in Earth's story where water, so often feared, was truly the safer refuge. Close your eyes and imagine crouching beside a swampy pool, somewhere deep in the Carboniferous forest. The air is heavy with humidity, so dense that even standing still makes your skin feel slick. Ferns and mosses surround you, their leaves brushing against your arms with every slight breeze. The shadows of towering club mosses block out most of the sun, casting the forest floor in shades of green and brown. From the pool at your feet comes a sound, the sudden plop of movement, followed by ripples spreading outward. Something has slipped beneath the surface. At first, the water seems still again. Then, just under the surface, you notice the faint shimmer of eyes staring back. It is not a fish. It is not yet a reptile. It is something in between. Amphibians were the bridge between two worlds. Their bodies still depended on water for reproduction, their eggs soft and unprotected, unable to survive drying out on land. Their skin was permeable, vulnerable to drying, forcing them to stay near moisture. Yet their limbs hinted at what was to come, structures strong enough to support weight, to crawl across roots, mud, and fallen trunks. Some were small, no bigger than your hand, darting between shallow puddles in search of insects. Others grew far larger, stretching 6 or even 8 feet in length, their wide mouths filled with rows of sharp teeth. These were not delicate creatures. They were ambush predators, waiting silently beneath the surface for unwary prey. But despite their size and teeth, they were not rulers of the land. Every attempt To venture too far from water brought them into a world already dominated by monsters. A dragonfly the size of a hawk could swoop down and pierce their flesh with needle-like jaws. A scorpion, armored and patient, could seize them in pincers before they had the chance to flee. On land, they were vulnerable, fragile, so they stayed near the water's edge. Every splash into a pool was an escape. Every murky pond was a shield against a forest filled with predators they could not yet overcome. The water was not free of danger. Primitive fish lurked beneath the surface, and even other amphibians posed threats to the weak. But compared to the land, the risks were far fewer. In the pools and streams, oxygen levels were lower. The very advantage that had allowed insects to grow into giants on land worked against them in water. Arthropods ruled the forest floor and canopy, but they could not dominate underwater. Amphibians could swim, they could dive, and they could use the murk as camouflage. The water was also a nursery. Amphibians laid their eggs in shallow pools, where gelatinous clumps floated like clusters of clear pearls. Out of these would hatch wriggling larvae, equipped with gills and tails like fish. They would grow in safety, feeding on algae, insect larvae, and smaller creatures until they developed legs and lungs. Only then would they face the harsh choice: stay near the refuge of the water or risk the deadly world beyond. For millions of years, most stayed, and for good reason. As strange as it may sound, the very forests that created this oxygen-rich world were also treacherous. The peats and vegetation of the Carboniferous did not decompose the way modern plants do. Fungi and microbes had not yet fully evolved the ability to break down the tough lignin in plant tissues. As a result, layers of half-decayed vegetation piled higher and higher, turning the land into a tinderbox. And with oxygen saturating the air, fire was always waiting. Lightning strikes could ignite enormous wildfires that swept through the forests. Flames would roar up the trunks of giant mosses, sending showers of sparks into the canopy. Smoke would darken the skies for weeks, choking anything that tried to breathe on land. For amphibians, such fires were deadly traps unless they were near water. In the ponds and swamps, they could burrow into mud, submerge beneath the surface, and wait until the flames passed overhead. Once again, the water offered safety where land could not. Imagine the scene: an endless forest, the sky glowing orange, insects scattering in a storm of wings. On the ground, creatures flee in all directions, and in the pools, amphibians wait, their bodies pressed against the cool mud, surrounded by ripples of ash. For them, water was not simply a habitat, it was survival. But the Carboniferous was not only a time of danger, it was also a time of abundance. The swamps stretched across continents, covering much of what is now North America and Europe. Towering plants drew in sunlight and carbon, growing faster than any ecosystem before or since. The abundance of vegetation supported countless insects, which in turn provided endless food for amphibians. For the amphibians who mastered life at the water's edge, this was a golden age. The swamps were nurseries, feeding grounds, and fortresses. Yet each attempt to push farther onto land tested the limits of evolution. Some succeeded, developing thicker skins, stronger legs, and eggs that no longer required water. These were the first reptiles, and they would one day reshape the earth. But in this chapter of history, their kind was rare. The forest was still the kingdom of insects, and the waters still the sanctuary of amphibians. When we look back at this age, it becomes clear the story of amphibians in the Carboniferous was not one of conquest, but of hesitation. They lingered at the edges, caught between two worlds. In the water, they were masters. They could ambush prey, reproduce safely, and evade the giants of the land. In the forests, they were intruders, clumsy and exposed. Their lungs and limbs gave them possibilities, but not yet dominance. And so, evolution held its breath. For millions of years, the balance remained the same. Amphibians grew larger, more diverse, but they did not yet claim the land. Instead, they perfected the art of living at the edge, half in, half out, always within reach of water. It was only much later, when reptiles began to rise, that the equation shifted. But in this singular moment in Earth's history, the truth was clear. The water was safer than the land. Picture the edge of a swamp at twilight, 310 million years ago. Mist curls low across the surface, blurring the line between air and water. The last rays of light cut through the canopy of ferns and mosses, glinting off the rippling pools below. Beneath the surface, amphibians rest in the safety of water, their eyes just above the film. On the banks, insects hum, scorpions prowl, and the shadows of giant millipedes stretch long in the fading glow. For millions of years, this cycle had remained unchanged. Amphibians clung to the water's edge, and arthropods ruled the land. But among the shadows, something new was stirring. A creature no larger than your hand creeps onto a fallen log. Its body is not slick and wet like an amphibian's. Its skin is dry, armored against evaporation, and within it, it carries an innovation so profound that it will alter the fate of life on Earth forever. This is no amphibian. This is one of the first reptiles. The leap from water to land was not a single step. It was a chain of adaptations, small changes passed down through generations, each one adding a new tool for survival. The greatest of these was the amniotic egg. Amphibians laid their eggs in water, soft, jelly-like clusters that would desiccate in dry air within hours. Their offspring hatched as larvae, breathing through gills, tied to aquatic life until metamorphosis. For them, land was a realm they could only borrow, never fully own. Reptiles broke this bond. Their eggs were encased in protective membranes, sealed in leathery shells. Inside each, the embryo floated in its own miniature sea, nourished and shielded from the air outside. No longer did reproduction depend on swamps and ponds. For the first time, life could spread into the dry heart of the forest, far from water's edge. It was a quiet revolution. No sound marked its arrival, no great upheaval. But with each clutch of eggs laid in soil instead of water, the balance of history began to shift. Another difference marked these new arrivals. Amphibians breathed and absorbed water through their skin, leaving them vulnerable to drying. Reptiles developed scales, layers of keratin that sealed moisture inside. Their bodies were armored not just against predators, but against the land itself. To move deeper into the forests, to crawl across dry ridges, to explore where amphibians dared not. This was only possible because their bodies carried their own water. Yet even with these advantages, the first reptiles were not conquerors. They were small, quiet creatures. In a forest ruled by dragonflies as large as birds and millipedes longer than crocodiles, reptiles crept unnoticed. They lived in the leaf litter, in the shadows of roots, in the safe corners where giants could not follow. It is easy, from our vantage point, to imagine reptiles immediately rising to dominance. But in this time, they were fragile upstarts. The land still trembled under the march of Arthropleura. The air still thrummed with the wings of Meganeura. The undergrowth still rustled with armored scorpions. These giants, empowered by oxygen-rich air, held their grip. For a reptile no larger than a lizard, each step into the open was fraught with danger. A dragonfly could seize it in its jaws. A scorpion could crush it beneath pincers. Even smaller amphibians, lurking in pools, could swallow it whole. So while reptiles carried the seeds of the future, they lived cautiously in the present. They clung to the margins of the forest, to the niches overlooked by giants. Evolution had given them the tools to escape the tyranny of water, but the land was not yet ready to give up its rulers. This was the paradox of the Carboniferous. The tools of conquest had been invented, but the conquest itself had not yet begun. Water remained the safer refuge. Amphibians continued to dominate ponds, rivers, and swamps. Their bodies perfectly adapted for ambush and survival in wet places. Insects still swarmed in numbers beyond comprehension, filling the skies and forest floors. Fire still raged across oxygen-rich forests, driving creatures back into the water. And yet, the reptiles waited, patient, silent, surviving in the margins. Each egg laid on dry ground was a step toward the future. Each scale that protected against drying was a shield carried into the unknown. The amphibians could not see it. The insects could not know it. But history was tilting. Slowly, invisibly, the balance of power was beginning to shift. Fossils from this time revealed delicate impressions of reptilian feet pressed into ancient mud, tiny clawed toes, frozen in stone, tell us of their presence in a world not yet theirs. These tracks wind through ferns and across fallen logs, silent testimony to creatures that lived in the shadows of giants. But tracks also tell another story: persistence. For every danger that lurked, for every insect that could snatch them away, reptiles endured. They laid eggs, they hatched, they crawled, and they returned to the soil again and again. Over time, their numbers grew, still small, still hidden, but steady. Evolution was writing a new chapter in patient strokes, preparing the land for a day when reptiles would not only survive, but rule. Yet even as this quiet revolution unfolded, the reality for most creatures remained the same. The water was safer than the land. For amphibians, the water was sanctuary from dragonflies and scorpions. For insects too small to compete with giants, ponds and streams offered a refuge. For early reptiles, even with their new eggs and skins, the water's edge still promised cover and escape. Land was dangerous, unstable, filled with predators and fire. Water was calm, protective, nurturing. This balance, fragile, temporary, and unique, was the hallmark of the Carboniferous. It was the only age in history when the scales tipped this way, when water, not land, was the safer place to be. For millions of years, the swamps of the Carboniferous seemed eternal. Vast forests of towering club mosses, ferns, and horsetails blanketed the continents. Their roots wove into thick mats, binding soggy soils. Their trunks soared more than 100 feet, fanning out into green crowns that dimmed the sun. Beneath their canopy, amphibians thrived, insects reigned, and reptiles crept quietly in the shadows. It was a world of abundance, damp, humid, bursting with life. But abundance can mask fragility. The forests that seemed unshakable were in fact a delicate machine, finely tuned to a particular balance of climate and atmosphere. And over time, that balance began to tilt. The earth never stays still. Beneath its crust, tectonic plates drift. Mountains rise. Seas retreat. Continents collide. In the late Carboniferous, these forces conspired to change the world's stage. Slowly, the swamps began to shrink. Regions that had once been wet year-round grew drier. Uplift from colliding land masses drained basins, shifting rivers, and disrupting the cycles of flooding that had fed the great forests. The climate itself grew harsher. Glacial cycles gripped the planet, locking water into ice near the poles, altering sea levels and weather patterns. What had once been endless humidity fractured into seasons of drought and flood. The great swamps that had seemed eternal were, in fact, temporary. At the height of the Carboniferous, oxygen in Earth's atmosphere reached nearly 35%. This surplus fueled the gigantism of insects and arthropods, allowing dragonflies to grow to hawk-sized hunters and centipedes to lengths longer than humans. But this high oxygen was linked to the forests themselves. The vast swamp plants pulled carbon dioxide from the air and pumped oxygen back into it. Their growth was relentless, their roots locking carbon into the ground, their tissues fueling a cycle that enriched the atmosphere. As long as the forests thrived, oxygen remained high. But as the swamps collapsed, so too did the oxygen. By the early Permian, levels had dropped closer to modern values. For giant insects, this was catastrophic. Their breathing systems, so effective in oxygen-rich air, could not sustain their massive bodies in thinner atmospheres. One by one, the giants disappeared. Meganeura, the enormous dragonfly, vanished. Arthropleura, the armored millipede, dwindled and died out. The giant scorpions and oversized spiders faded into extinction. The land that had once been ruled by crawling and buzzing titans grew quieter. As oxygen fell, fire did not vanish. It still haunted the forests, but now it carried a different sting. Where once fires had been brief interruptions in a cycle of growth, now droughts stretched their scars deeper. Forests burned, and the land did not regrow so quickly. Ash covered the soil. Rivers dried into cracked mud. Amphibians, tied still to water, saw their habitats vanish piece by piece. For the first time in millions of years, water no longer promised safety everywhere. Pools shrank, swamps drained. Entire populations of amphibians collapsed with their disappearing wetlands. And as amphibians struggled, reptiles, those quiet survivors in the shadows, began to find opportunity. What had once been a disadvantage, dry skin, shelled eggs, lungs built for air, now became the tools of survival. Amphibians gasped as their swamps vanished, their jelly-coated eggs shriveling in dry air. Reptiles, by contrast, could carry life inland. They could roam away from rivers, nest on dry ground, and breathe in thinning oxygen with lungs better suited than any amphibian's skin. The land barrel was still dangerous. Insects still lurked. Scorpions still stung. And drought still scorched. But reptiles had patience. They could endure what others could not. And slowly, steadily, they began to spread. The Carboniferous had been a paradox. A time when water was safer than land, when amphibians ruled and insects grew monstrous. But that balance was never meant to last. As the forests collapsed, the paradox unraveled. Amphibians lost their swamps, insects lost their oxygen, giants lost their place. What remained were reptiles, small at first, quiet, still overshadowed, but holding the keys to the future. Their eggs, their scales, their independence from water would soon let them take the land in ways no amphibian ever could. And so, out of fire, drought, and decline, the stage was set for the next great act of life's story. By the end of the Carboniferous and into the Permian, much of Earth had transformed. The swamps that had stretched like endless green seas were gone. In their place, dry uplands spread, deserts formed, forests grew patchier, scattered where rainfall remained. To walk through this world was to see a planet remade. Where once dragonflies filled the air, now silence spread. Where millipedes had marched, only the rustle of reptiles remained. Where amphibians had croaked in countless ponds, only dry earth echoed. The land that had once been a nightmare of insects was clearing. The danger was shifting, and reptiles, once small and hidden, began to rise into the open. The swamps had fallen. The oxygen-rich canopy of the Carboniferous had burned, dried, and collapsed. Amphibians, once masters of the wetlands, found themselves trapped by shrinking pools, their eggs vulnerable in the open air. The insect giants that had filled the forests with buzzing wings and armoured bodies were dwindling. But while one empire collapsed, another stirred. In the shadows of the fallen forests, reptiles began their quiet conquest. Reptiles were not large. They were not powerful. Compared to the armoured arthropods or amphibious giants, they seemed fragile. But they carried an advantage no other group possessed: independence from water. The shelled egg was their passport. Unlike the jelly-like eggs of amphibians, reptile eggs carried their own private pond. A leathery or calcified shell sealed in moisture, while specialized membranes provided food, protection, and waste removal. For the first time in Earth's history, vertebrates could truly live away from rivers and swamps. Their bodies told the same story: scaly skin locked in water, stronger lungs pulled oxygen from thinner air, clawed feet dug into soil instead of mud. Where amphibians gasped and struggled, reptiles walked freely. The land that had once been too dangerous, too unstable, too alien, now belonged to them. Among the first wave of reptilian conquerors were the synapsids, a lineage that would one day lead to mammals. Synapsids were distinguished by a single opening behind each eye socket, a structural adaptation that allowed for stronger jaw muscles and more efficient chewing. At first, they were small insect eaters, creeping through dry forests and scrublands. But in time, they grew bolder. Dimetrodon, with its great sailback spine, prowled river valleys in the early Permian. Though often mistaken for a dinosaur, it was a synapsid, a distant relative of mammals. Its sail may have helped regulate temperature in the shifting climates, absorbing morning warmth or releasing excess heat in midday. Edaphosaurus, another sailback synapsid, turned to plants. It was one of the first large herbivores on land, scraping tough vegetation with specialized teeth. For the first time, vertebrates were splitting into hunters and grazers on land. The stage was being set for entire food chains independent of the water. Alongside synapsids were the diapsids, reptiles with two openings behind the eye socket. This design would prove to be one of evolution's great successes. The earliest diapsids were small and lizard-like, darting through underbrush, preying on insects, scavenging what they could. They were unremarkable, yet their lineage would give rise to some of the most extraordinary creatures in history. Crocodiles, lizards, snakes, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. In the dry Permian landscapes, diapsids were still humble, but they had time. The collapse of the Carboniferous swamps left scars. Much of Earth's land had dried into open scrub, with only patches of forest and occasional wetlands. Fires still swept across plains. Droughts tested every living thing. But reptiles turned challenge into opportunity. Where amphibians faltered, reptiles filled the gaps. Where giant insects vanished, reptiles took their place as predators. Where plants adapted to drier soils, reptiles followed, browsing, hunting, and scavenging in lockstep with the shifting world. For the first time in history, land was no longer a place of danger alone. It was beginning to stabilize, to carry life confidently on its surface. And reptiles, small, unassuming, but tireless, were the architects of this new age. By the mid-Permian, reptiles had spread across continents. Some grazed tough ferns and seed plants. Others prowled as ambush hunters. Still others dug burrows to escape the heat, marking the first signs of complex behavior on land. The world was becoming their domain. Amphibians had not vanished, but they were no longer the rulers they once had been. Their reign had depended on water. Reptiles had broken free of that chain. The paradox of the Carboniferous was over. No longer was water safer than land. Now, for the first time, land itself was becoming a stronghold. But this was only the beginning. The Permian would not just elevate reptiles. It would test them with one of the most catastrophic events in Earth's history. The Carboniferous swamps had fallen. Once infinite oceans of green had been reduced to dry plains, scattered forests, and patchy wetlands. Fires had become more frequent, droughts more severe, and the once endless moisture of the land had begun to ebb. Yet amid this harshness, a new world of life emerged, a world dominated not by insects or amphibians, but by reptiles. At first glance, the land seemed quiet compared to the thrumming forests of the Carboniferous. Gone were the massive dragonflies, whose wingspan darkened the sky, and the armored centipedes that shook the ground with each step. Even scorpions, though still formidable, had largely diminished in size. The landscape, however, was far from empty. life had not retreated, it had transformed. The stage was set for vertebrates to truly claim the land. Reptiles carried with them innovations that allowed them to thrive where amphibians and earlier arthropods could not. First among these was the amniotic egg. Unlike the soft, water-dependent eggs of amphibians, reptilian eggs were encased in a protective shell or membrane. Inside, the embryo floated in its own supply of liquid, cushioned from the drying air and shielded from small predators. This simple yet revolutionary adaptation freed vertebrates from rivers, lakes and ponds, allowing life to extend far into dry forests, rocky outcrops and scrublands. Equally important was their scaly skin. Where amphibians relied on moisture to breathe and hydrate, reptiles carried a built-in armor. Their scales locked water inside, preventing desiccation in the increasingly arid Permian landscapes. With lungs designed for air, not gills or skin diffusion, reptiles could venture confidently across open land, climb rocky hills, and burrow into soil to escape heat. This combination of traits, egg, skin, and lungs, was subtle in appearance, but monumental in consequence. It was no exaggeration to say that reptiles were, for the first time in vertebrate history, truly independent of water. Ecosystems were now layered. Predators, like Dimetrodon, patrolled open plains and riverbanks, relying on stealth, speed, and ambush tactics. Smaller diapsids darted in and out of underbrush, avoiding larger hunters while feeding on insects, small amphibians, or fallen carcasses. Herbivorous synapsids grazed the scrub, their movements shaping vegetation patterns and influencing predator behavior. This balance, though dynamic, was still fragile. Seasonal droughts could eliminate food sources. Fires could devastate territories in hours. Yet reptiles' physiological and behavioral innovations allowed them to navigate these hazards successfully. The Carboniferous paradox, when water was safer than land, was gone. Now, land had become the primary arena for survival, and water, while still protective, was no longer the only safe refuge. Despite the dominance of reptiles, the Permian world remained precarious. Volcanic activity in regions like Siberia was beginning to release massive volumes of gas and ash into the atmosphere. Climate instability intensified. Forests and plains were at risk of abrupt change. No matter how well adapted, reptiles could not predict or escape these forces. The very ecosystems they had conquered were on the edge of collapse. The stage was being set for the Permian-Triassic mass extinction, a cataclysm that would erase over 90% of all species and redraw the map of life on Earth. Yet, for a brief window of millions of years, reptiles were the uncontested rulers of the land. They thrived where amphibians could not. They expanded into new niches. They became the architects of terrestrial life. Walking across the Permian landscape, one would witness the first complex terrestrial ecosystems dominated by vertebrates. Small diapsids hunting insects, mid-sized synapsids grazing and evading predators, giant Dimetrodon patrolling riverbanks, each species interacting in ways that shaped the environment itself. Rivers were no longer just lifelines for amphibians. They became hunting grounds, migratory corridors, and ecological hubs. Plains and scrublands, once barren and dangerous, became playgrounds for creatures capable of thriving in dry conditions. The transition was complete. Reptiles had taken command of the land, and for the first time in Earth's history, survival on dry terrain was no longer reserved for the smallest or most cautious. Instead, it favored those equipped with the tools of independence, resilience, and adaptation. The Permian Kingdom was a marvel, yet precarious. Reptiles had adapted to everything the land could throw at them: heat, dryness, predation, and competition. But the universe had another trial in store: mass extinction. Still, in this moment, they reigned. Reptiles were dominant not by luck, but by evolutionary strategy. The combination of amniotic eggs, scaly skin, lungs for air, and behavioral flexibility had allowed life to thrive in a world where land had once been more dangerous than water. It was a fleeting moment of perfection, a high point of terrestrial evolution before catastrophe reshaped the very face of the planet. By the late Permian, the world that reptiles had built was nearing a tipping point. For millions of years, synapsids and diapsids had thrived across dry plains, scrublands, and patchy forests. They had conquered what had once been the realm of amphibians and insects, turning land into a kingdom of vertebrates. But nature, as always, has cycles of creation and destruction. Volcanic activity in the Siberian traps began releasing enormous quantities of gas and ash into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur dioxide clouds slowly thickened the air. Climate instability followed. Temperatures soared in some regions, scorching the land and desiccating rivers. Acid rain fell across forests and plains, damaging plants and polluting waterways. Oxygen levels fluctuated, creating physiological stress for animals adapted to steady conditions. Reptiles, though resilient, faced a world shifting faster than they could adapt. Their dominance became a double-edged sword. The very traits that allowed them to conquer dry land, eggs independent of water, scaly skin, and strong lungs, could not protect them from atmospheric changes, toxic fumes, or massive environmental collapse. Forests, once teeming with life, began to thin. Fires, drought, and disease decimated plant communities. Herbivorous synapsids, relying on tough plants, suffered mass die-offs. Predators, dependent on these herbivores, soon followed. Insects shrank in size as oxygen levels dropped, losing the colossal forms of the Carboniferous. Aquatic life, particularly in rivers and shallow seas, began to flourish relative to the chaos on land. Amphibians and fish could survive longer in water than reptiles could on dry plains, restoring the ancient paradox. For the first time in tens of millions of years, water was safer than land once more. Some species found ways to endure. Small burrowing reptiles escaped the worst heat and acid fallout underground. Aquatic and semi-aquatic vertebrates persisted in rivers, lakes, and coastal areas. Early diapsids and certain synapsids with flexible diets survived longer, exploiting niches less affected by plant die-offs. Yet, for the vast majority, survival was impossible. The Permian-Triassic extinction would wipe out over 90% of marine species and around 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. The dominance that reptiles had once enjoyed on land was almost entirely obliterated. Water offered stability. It buffered temperature swings, diluted toxic chemicals, and maintained oxygen more consistently than air. For surviving vertebrates, rivers, lakes, and shallow seas became life rafts amid a dying world. Amphibians, long marginalized by reptiles, regained relative safety in wetlands. Aquatic plants, fish, and invertebrates survived in areas shielded from the full force of volcanic and climatic upheavals. In this inverted world, the land, once a playground for reptiles, became a graveyard, while water offered refuge and hope. The Permian collapse marked the end of a golden age for early reptiles. Synapsids, which had once dominated plains and forests, were reduced to small, scattered populations. Diapsids, though surviving, were few and fragile. Yet, this catastrophe was not merely an ending, it was a reset. The surviving lineages would seed the Triassic, setting the stage for the rise of dinosaurs, mammals, and modern reptiles. Life learned a hard lesson. Dominance is fragile, and even the strongest creatures must respect the power of environmental change. Looking back, the story is striking. Carboniferous, a world where land was deadly due to enormous insects and amphibians. Water offered safety. Permian, reptiles adapt. Land becomes safer, and vertebrates dominate. Permian Triassic extinction. Catastrophic change reverses the advantage. Water becomes a refuge again. The pattern is clear. Earth's history is a pendulum of safety and danger, shifting between land and water as environmental forces dictate survival. From the extreme swamps of the Carboniferous to the dry Permian plains, and then to the global collapse of the end Permian, one truth emerges. Life's success is never guaranteed. Adaptation can grant temporary dominance, but only resilience to change ensures continuity. Reptiles thrived because of innovation and flexibility, yet they nearly perished because even the strongest strategies can fail against planetary-scale catastrophes. The survivors of this era would go on to shape life on Earth for millions of years. Water, once a sanctuary in the Carboniferous, became a refuge again, reminding us that survival often lies not in strength alone, but in the ability to endure. The world had changed irreversibly. The Permian-Triassic extinction had left a scar across every continent, wiping out an estimated 90% of marine species and around 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. The reptiles that once ruled the dry Permian plains were gone, their dominance reduced to fragments. The once powerful synapsids had dwindled, and even diapsids were only sparsely represented. Yet life persisted. In the aftermath of catastrophe, the survivors began a slow, quiet resurgence. Triassic landscapes were harsh and unpredictable, but they were also a blank canvas, an opportunity for evolution to rewrite the rules. The first Triassic world was stark. Vast deserts stretched across supercontinent Pangaea. Water was scarce, and vegetation was limited to hardy ferns, gymnosperms, and the occasional floodplain forest. River systems were vital lifelines, supporting the few surviving amphibians and fish. Swamps were rare, and the Carboniferous-style oxygen-rich canopy was gone forever. For the survivors, adaptation was no longer a choice. It was survival. Every day was a challenge. Heat, drought, and scarce food created intense selective pressures. Species that had once relied on stability were now forced to innovate, migrate, or perish. Reptiles, already adapted for life on dry land, were uniquely suited to exploit the post-extinction world. Small, agile diapsids scuttled across arid plains, feeding on insects and scavenging wherever possible. Early synapsids that had survived in isolated refuges began to reclaim niches, often competing with these new diapsids. The most consequential group to emerge were the archosaurs, ruling reptiles whose lineage would dominate the Mesozoic. Early archosaurs were small, fast, and bipedal. Some were predators, preying on insects and smaller vertebrates. Others were herbivores, nibbling on tough Triassic plants. Their lightweight skeletons and upright posture gave them a mobility advantage that amphibians and the surviving synapsids could not match. The Triassic world was dangerous. Predators lurked in open scrublands and along rivers, waiting for the unwary. Early archosaurs hunted with speed and strategy, while smaller reptiles relied on camouflage, agility, and burrowing to survive. Theropods' ancestors, small bipedal predators, darted through floodplains, striking quickly and retreating before larger predators could respond. Herbivorous synapsids, though diminished, grazed carefully, using group behavior to reduce predation risk. Semi-aquatic reptiles patrolled rivers and wetlands, hunting fish and amphibians while avoiding land-based predators. Every ecosystem was a delicate balance, with survival hinging on speed, intelligence, and adaptability. After the Permian collapse, water had once again become a safer refuge. Riverbanks, lakes, and coastal wetlands offered protection from the harsh sun, fires, and predatory reptiles dominating the land. Amphibians, which had been nearly outcompeted in the Permian, found sanctuary in aquatic habitats. Fish, mollusks, and early aquatic plants thrived, forming rich ecosystems where life could persist despite global instability. Yet land was no longer completely hostile. Reptiles were slowly expanding into deserts, plains, and forests, reclaiming dry landscapes with each passing generation. The balance between aquatic refuge and terrestrial opportunity was delicate, and the survivors who could navigate both worlds would thrive. Among the archosaurs, subtle innovations were setting the stage for the Mesozoic. Upright posture allowed more efficient locomotion. Longer legs enabled rapid pursuit of prey or escape from predators. Flexible jaws and sharper teeth enhanced feeding strategies. These early archosaurs were small compared to the giants they would become, but their biology hinted at the future. Creatures capable of dominating terrestrial ecosystems with speed, power, and cunning. The foundations for dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and even crocodilians were being laid quietly but inexorably in the Triassic landscape. The Triassic recovery illustrates the resilience of life. Despite the greatest extinction in Earth's history, evolution pressed forward. Reptiles, already primed for terrestrial life, exploited opportunities. Aquatic refuges maintained populations of species that might have otherwise disappeared. Ecosystems began to diversify once more, laying the groundwork for the extraordinary evolutionary radiations of the Jurassic and Cretaceous. It was a world still dangerous, but life had adapted to danger. Water remained a safe haven, but land had become a place of opportunity, a proving ground for the survivors and innovators who would shape Earth's next great era. The story of the Permian collapse and Triassic recovery reminds us that survival is not about dominance alone. It is about flexibility, innovation, and resilience. The water that had been safe in the Carboniferous became dangerous during the Permian and then returned as refuge in the Triassic. Land, once perilous, became a realm of opportunity for those prepared to seize it. Life adapts, endures, and evolves, even in the face of near total annihilation. The survivors of this era were the architects of the Mesozoic world, laying the foundations for the age of dinosaurs and the eventual rise of mammals. The Triassic recovery set the stage for an evolutionary revolution. By the early Jurassic, the survivors of the Permian-Triassic collapse had diversified into a dazzling array of forms. Reptiles dominated the land, while mammals remained small and unobtrusive. Aquatic ecosystems teemed with life, offering refuge and stability amid terrestrial dangers. Life had learned a critical lesson. Survival depended on adaptation, timing, and the ability to exploit both land and water. Among the archosaurs that survived the Triassic, a particular lineage began to flourish: the dinosaurs. These creatures, initially small and bipedal, evolved rapidly in response to the complex Triassic landscapes. By the Jurassic, dinosaurs had diversified into a variety of ecological niches: theropods, agile predators as prowled plains and forests, relying on keen eyesight, speed, and intelligence to capture prey. Sauropodomorphs, the ancestors of the colossal sauropods, grazed on ferns and gymnosperms, gradually evolving longer necks and massive bodies to access the upper foliage of recovering forests. Ornithischians, early herbivores with specialized teeth and digestive systems, began exploring new feeding strategies and social behaviors. This rapid diversification created a terrestrial ecosystem dominated by reptiles unlike any before. Dinosaurs became the rulers of land, reshaping the very landscapes they inhabited. While dinosaurs flourished, early mammals remained small, nocturnal, and often hidden. Their success relied on being unobtrusive and adaptable. Insects, seeds, and small vertebrates formed the backbone of their diet. Mammals retained traits that had allowed their synapsid ancestors to survive the Permian extinction. Burrowing and nocturnal behaviors kept them safe from predation. Flexible diets allowed survival in fluctuating environments. Rapid reproductive cycles ensured population resilience. Though overshadowed by dinosaurs in size and dominance, mammals were quietly diversifying, laying the foundation for future evolutionary success. Despite land dominance by dinosaurs, water remained a haven for survival. Rivers, lakes, and coastal wetlands offered protection from terrestrial predators, food resources, and stable microclimates. Aquatic reptiles, like early crocodilians, thrived along riverbanks and lake shores, hunting fish and small terrestrial prey. Amphibians, still dependent on moist environments, found safety in wetlands and rivers. Fish, mollusks, and invertebrates thrived in abundant freshwater and shallow marine ecosystems. The dynamic between land and water created a constant tension. Land offered opportunity and reward, but also immense danger, while water provided relative safety at the cost of limited mobility and resources. Predation became increasingly complex. Dinosaurs developed strategies for hunting and defense. Pack-hunting theropods coordinated attacks to overpower larger herbivores. Armored herbivores, like stegosaurs, evolved defensive adaptations, including spikes, plates, and tails designed to deter predators. Ornithischians adopted herd behaviors to confuse predators and protect young. In aquatic environments, predator-prey interactions remained critical for survival. Crocodilian ancestors patrolled rivers, snapping at unwary fish and amphibians. Early turtles and aquatic reptiles evolved shells and other defenses to survive in predator-rich waters. The Mesozoic world was not uniformly safe. Arid deserts, fluctuating river levels, and volcanic activity presented persistent hazards. Fires periodically swept across dry landscapes, echoing the Carboniferous threat, but now met by resilient reptiles. Seasonal droughts could turn rivers into shallow pools, concentrating predators and prey alike. Floods, conversely, created temporary aquatic havens, but also risked drowning terrestrial creatures. Despite these challenges, life flourished. The Mesozoic represented a balance between opportunity and risk, a time when evolution honed both strategy and adaptation. By the early Jurassic, a clear pattern had emerged. Land, dominated by dinosaurs, full of opportunity, but hazardous due to size, predation, and environmental extremes. Water provided refuge, stability, and resources, though mobility and space were limited. Survival required understanding both domains. Species that could navigate between land and water, or exploit aquatic and terrestrial niches, had the highest likelihood of enduring. The Mesozoic dawn was a story of resilience, innovation, and adaptation. Reptiles reclaimed and dominated land. Mammals learned to survive in the shadows, and water continued to serve as a refuge when land became perilous. This period illustrates a central theme of Earth's history. Safety is relative, and survival is a dynamic balance between opportunity and risk. From the Carboniferous swamps to the Permian collapse and into the Mesozoic, life adapted continuously, shifting between land and water depending on environmental pressures. The stage was set for the long Mesozoic reign of dinosaurs, the continuing evolution of mammals, and the complex ecosystems that would define life for the next 150 million years. By the mid-Mesozoic, Earth had become a planet transformed by evolutionary ambition and survival pressures. Life was no longer simple. It was a symphony of competition, adaptation, and strategy. Vast forests, floodplains, and deserts stretched across Pangaea, offering both opportunity and peril. Here, reptiles reigned supreme, from the smallest feathered theropods to the towering sauropods that cast shadows over entire valleys. Yet, even at the zenith of land-based dominance, water retained its quiet authority. Rivers, lakes, and coastal wetlands were sanctuaries, buffering life from fire, drought, and predator-driven chaos. Survival often depended on the ability to navigate both domains, exploiting the richness of land while respecting the relative safety of water. The Mesozoic is defined by its giants. Sauropods, such as Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus, were towering herbivores, stretching high into treetops to feed on the most inaccessible foliage. Their long necks and massive torsos were evolutionary marvels, allowing them to dominate landscapes, both as consumers and ecological engineers. Their sheer presence shaped forests, fallen trees, trampled undergrowth, and nutrient recycling all created microhabitats that smaller creatures relied upon. Meanwhile, theropods evolved into apex predators. From the mid-sized Allosaurus hunting in packs to the massive Tyrannosaurus rex stalking floodplains, these hunters perfected coordination, speed, and sensory acuity. Every footfall, claw swipe, and stealthy approach defined life and death across these landscapes. The predator-prey balance was dynamic, ever-shifting, and brutally efficient. Even the skies teemed with life. Pterosaurs, some with wingspans rivaling small aircraft, soared over river valleys and plains. They hunted fish, small terrestrial reptiles, and scavenged carrion, demonstrating that danger was not confined to the land. Their aerial mastery added another dimension to survival. Flight became both a tool for hunting and an escape from terrestrial perils. Despite the dominance of terrestrial megafauna, water remained a sanctuary and a cradle of resilience. Rivers, wetlands, and coastal lagoons provided protection from predation, a place where smaller reptiles and amphibians could escape from land-based hunters. Stable resources, fish, crustaceans, mollusks, and aquatic plants offered consistent food sources, even when land resources fluctuated. Safe breeding grounds. Amphibians, turtles, and early crocodilians laid eggs and raised young in protected aquatic environments. The Mesozoic demonstrates that even in eras of terrestrial dominance, aquatic habitats remained critical for species survival. Life evolved strategies to exploit both worlds, balancing risk and reward. The ecosystems of the Mesozoic were intricately connected. Predators and prey co-evolved, creating a web of adaptations and counter-adaptations. Herd behavior. Large herbivores such as stegosaurs and ornithischians moved in herds, confusing predators and protecting young. Armored defenses, spikes, plates, and tails evolved to fend off predation, while predators developed intelligence and coordination to overcome these defenses. Aquatic predation, crocodilian ancestors, amphibians, and fish in rivers hunted opportunistically, maintaining pressure on both aquatic and semi-aquatic prey. Seasonal and environmental changes added layers of complexity. Floods created temporary havens for some species, while concentrating predators in confined areas. Droughts pushed terrestrial creatures to compete fiercely for diminishing water resources. Fires occasionally swept across forests, echoing the Carboniferous and Permian threats, but now tempered by larger, more resilient species. Mesozoic vegetation was both a boon and a hazard. Gymnosperms, ferns, and early angiosperms provided food and shelter. But forests also concealed dangers. Predators could hide in dense foliage, waiting for prey to wander too close. For herbivores, navigating these forests required vigilance, memory, and social cooperation. The landscape itself became a participant in survival, shaping evolutionary pressures as much as predators did. Water bodies amplified these dynamics. Riparian zones supported lush vegetation that provided both food and cover. Flooded areas could temporarily trap herbivores, making them vulnerable to predators, or conversely, offer aquatic escape routes. Life was constantly negotiating the shifting borders between land and water, safety and danger. The Mesozoic illustrates that ecosystems are intricately interwoven. The survival of one species often depended on the presence or absence of others. Large herbivores shaped the forest, influencing plant growth and soil composition. Predators maintained herbivore populations, preventing overgrazing. Aquatic species supported terrestrial life by nutrient cycling, while wetlands served as nurseries and sanctuaries. Water remained a stabilizing force, preserving biodiversity even as the land experienced fluctuating risks. Evolution favored species capable of exploiting both terrestrial and aquatic environments. From the Carboniferous swamps to the Permian collapse and into the apex Mesozoic, a recurring truth emerges. Land offers reward but danger. The tallest, fastest, and strongest may dominate, but mortality is high. Water offers refuge but limits opportunity. Protection comes at the cost of mobility and territory. Flexibility is survival. Species that exploit both domains endure, while specialists may perish when conditions change. The age of dinosaurs demonstrates the delicate equilibrium between opportunity and safety, risk and resilience. Even at the height of land-based dominance, water continued to serve as a sanctuary, shaping evolutionary pathways and ensuring life's persistence. The Mesozoic apex is a testament to the dynamic relationship between land and water. Dinosaurs may have ruled the plains, forests, and deserts, but water remained essential for survival. Amphibians, fish, aquatic reptiles, and even early mammals relied on aquatic habitats to endure periods of danger. Earth's history repeatedly reminds us dominance is temporary, ecosystems are interconnected, and survival favors the adaptable. Across hundreds of millions of years, the story is clear. Land can be perilous, yet water offers refuge. From the Carboniferous to the Mesozoic, from insects that towered above humans to dinosaurs that shook the land, life has always navigated the balance between danger and sanctuary, between land and water, shaping the incredible diversity we see today. The Mesozoic may have ended millions of years ago, but its lessons echo in every river, swamp, and floodplain today, whispering the enduring truth. Sometimes, survival is not about being the strongest on land, but about knowing where safety truly lies.